Hi everyone, my name is Cody Baynard, and today I am going to be reviewing the latest studio album from Humanity's Last Breath, titled Ashen. Humanity's Last Breath is a progressive deathcore band from Sweden who take on a very particular style of guitar work that is very loosely referred to as Thall. If you don't know what Thall means, essentially a lot of contrast between very high frequencies and extremely low frequencies, lots of very erratic and at times nonsensical rhythmatic patterns, and a pretty big fetish for bending guitar strings. It kind of takes the foundation of the Djent style that Meshuggah helped to establish and take it in a direction that is a bit more expressive as well as to an extent a bit more atmospheric. And Humanity's Last Breath has been one of the strongest bands within this style for the past few years, in my opinion. Over the course of their career, they have essentially kept expanding on and evolving their sound with each studio record. And their last record, Vildhjarta, I would argue was probably the band's strongest work to date. For it very tastefully utilized elements of black metal, doom metal, prog metal, deathcore, all melded together within their signature Thall style of guitar work. And so after how much I really enjoyed Vildhjarta, I was naturally very excited for whatever Ashen would bring. And while I do think Ashen is overall a solid album, overall I am admittingly kind of disappointed in this thing. But let's start with the positives. A good amount of what makes this band's music so appealing in the first place is still very much present. The guitar work and the rhythmatic patterns are extremely technical and erratic and really stank-face-inducing, and the band can get quite creative with the way that they attempt to kind of like throw off the audience with its just insanely off-kilter grooves. On top of that, their sense of atmosphere is insanely menacing and enveloping as always. And if you combine that with the really vicious vocal performances from Philip Anderson, you have what is probably one of the darkest sounding progressive metal albums released this year, in my opinion. And honestly, Philip Anderson is becoming one of my personal favorite death metal and deathcore vocalists. He doesn't necessarily rely much on over-the-top vocal theatrics a la Lorna Shore or Infant Annihilator or whatever, and instead he just relies very heavily on just the monstrous, menacing tone of his gutturals, and that alone works insanely effectively. While this is very infrequent, he's also occasionally very capable of producing these really wonderful and also very melancholic clean vocals. All of these things results in a good amount of bangers that are found throughout this record's runtime. The opening track, Blood Spilled, which is the longest standalone song, introduces all of the different sounds and tones that the listener will be subject to throughout the rest of this album's runtime very effectively. Songs like Linger and Withering utilize these very big and also somewhat somber Gojira-like choruses. Lifeless, Deathless, and Catastrophize have some of the most stank-face-inducing grooves that I think are found throughout this record. Death Spiral very effectively utilizes these very fast double kicks throughout a good amount of its grooves, which really gets me pumped. And the two-part closer, Burden Bearer, while maybe not the best closer in the world, I think effectively utilizes ambience to build tension for when the guitars finally drop. Now, with all that being said, while a lot of this does work in isolation for these tracks, in context with the album, for me, a lot of things fall apart. Something that I've always enjoyed about Humanity's Last Breath is how Buster Oldehome is able to produce things in a way that is insanely compressed and punchy, in a way that almost borders on being too compressed for its own good, but never quite crosses over. And as a result, records like the previous album, Vildhjarta, sound big and enveloping and towering in a sense. Here this time, it's done to an extent where there's very frequently a lot of clipping. And sure, while I can to an extent appreciate the usage of clipping as a kind of stylistic choice, for I think it does occasionally effectively help to make things feel all the more oppressive and dark. For example, on the aforementioned opener Blood Spilled, there are these really freaky and very tense rising tones that sound even scarier thanks to this excessive usage of gain. And this also works during the very sonically chaotic finale of the track Instill, which, by the way, I forgot to mention, also utilizes some very effective and cinematic choir vocals. However, this is done way too much, to the point where halfway through the album, it really gets to the point where, as the Metal Meltdown described when talking about the production of the last Emotionless and White album, it almost feels as if that Buster just hates people with healthy eardrums. Like, it doesn't even sound like crushing and harrowing, it just eventually just feels annoying and kind of try-hard in a sense. And honestly, I don't even think this would feel so bad if the songwriting had enough dynamics in order to make sure that this level of heaviness feels impactful throughout. Unfortunately, however, this album doesn't really have that. And I would even argue that this album feels a little bit more samey in nature than a couple of their previous records, including Valde. As the tracklist goes on, the more that I feel like the songs have trouble sticking out from each other, which is not something that I felt as much listening to previous HLB records. Combine that with the excessively loud sound mix, and you, in my opinion, essentially get ear fatigue 101. So yeah, even though I did get a decent amount of enjoyment out of this record, those aspects unfortunately result this in being probably their weakest record yet. If you love just super bombastic, erratic Thall style guitar work and riffs and whatnot, I'm sure this album will do something for you like it has for me a little bit. But still, there are a ton of better options within the prog metal sphere that released this year, in my opinion, such as the latest records from bands like Sermon, The Ocean, Omnirod, Nightmare. Hell, I even got more enjoyment out of the new Sleep Token album than this. And if you're just looking for something that is just super crushing and super bleak, I would recommend something like the latest collab record from Full of Hell and Primitive Man instead. Sure, there are no deathcore or prog metal influences in that album whatsoever, but I feel that that record handles these big, gain-heavy, crushing walls of sound in more effective ways than on Ashen. And so yeah, those are my thoughts on the new Humanity's Last Breath album. And, you know, of course, this is just my opinion, so please let me know in the comments below, what did you think of this record? I do genuinely hope that you got more out of it than I did, considering that I was excited for it. I'm kind of envious of people who are liking it more than me. As always, please feel free to like and comment and subscribe, and I will see you guys next time. Have a good one.